about that.
Right.
Yeah, we're recording off and running. I took over on you, Andres. So welcome everybody. So today's panel is going to be discussing understanding of the research gap. So in effect, what is the research gap you may actually be seeking to fill? And can you really justify the research? Or in fact, how do you find the research gap itself? So how do you work out what the research gap is? What are the steps? So many doctoral students actually have struggled with establishing their research gap. So questions to help you understand this will be posed to the panel for their views. But first, I'd like to introduce the panel. So Dr. Andres Messner is a co-founder of DoctorateHub. He's a tutor, mentor, coach, and draws on contract research globally in innovation, ICT, education, management, and economics. Andres supervises DBA student candidates globally. I'd like to also introduce Professor Boston, who's also international research experience, that's the way to go, in quality management and environment protection management. Is a teacher, mentor, and coach. Has published numerous research papers and supervises both DBA and PhD doctoral candidates on a global stage. I'd also like to introduce Professor Steve McCabe. He's an economist and has taught since 1980s in business and management, strategy, and research methods. Steve is also an author of numerous articles, chapters, and books. And as the Director of Research, Steve oversees a doctoral program and supervises both PhD and DBA doctoral candidates, predominantly in the UK. And I'm Jack Hiddlestone-Mumford, an academic and supervisor, strategy and IT business consultant, chair of BAM Tracks in Strategy and Change Transformation, and a doctoral candidate as well. I'll be moderating today's session. So to maximise learning, as Andres said, if you wish to pose any questions or add them into the chat, we'll certainly add them into the mix. So let's kick off and pose a question to one of the panel members to address. First one is, what constitutes a research gap? Is it a literature, research, or knowledge gap that you should be seeking? Over to the panel.
Who wants to give it a start? Bastian, Stephen, anyone?
I would say Stephen should start with actually.
Okay, let's throw it to Stephen.
Theoretical approach.
What constitutes a research gap? Is it a literature, research, or knowledge gap you should be seeking?
I think it's a combination of both in contemporary terms, but it brings us back to the heart of the question, what is research? What is knowledge? You know, these are all fundamental questions. Our modern worlds are based upon sort of the understanding of the way in which there's interaction between physical elements and, of course, the sort of the social aspects. We live in a sort of highly complex socio-technical world, which didn't arrive there, or you know, the things that we use standardly didn't happen by accident. What I would like to draw your attention to is the sort of my own experience, which I think is useful, because when I was attempting to sort of try and understand the use of quality systems back in the sort of the late 80s, I was trying to grapple with, well, what does this thing consist of? And I was again trying to hypothesize and trying to make connection between I know, the introduction of quality systems and business improvement and performance and all the sort of other things that sort of were being touted by the sort of, as I sort of recognized, or at least then came to increasingly recognize, as the practitioner orientated literature, because of course they were selling a message, and you know, that's what led me to sort of to better understand that if you're going to sort of to develop a research gap, you've got to understand the sort of the nature of the thing that you're trying to sort of grapple with. What does it consist of? And it's founded by I don't know, the conceptualization, or to use another word which I like, it's constructs. But of course, once you start to sort of to distill these things or to deconstruct them, you know, constructs are just ways that we make sense of the things that we have around us. And again, I go back to sort of to ancient civilization. They didn't have the sort of the body of knowledge that we have. In fact, I sometimes think that our big problem is that we've got too much knowledge. And again, interestingly, I talked about the late 80s, which of course now is the sort of, what, 30 odd years ago. You know, there wasn't the internet. Now, of course, we can get knowledge at our fingertips, from sort of literally anywhere that we have free access to that knowledge. So to come back to sort of the question without making it too complicated, what you're looking for by and large is some sense of connection, and you know, and again, is it literature? Well, it can be, but I also think that what drove my interest at the sort of time was that there was something which was happening. There was a phenomenon occurring in organizations. Lots of people were introducing quality management for reasons which, you know, I'm not going to sort of elaborate on here, some of which were genuinely well-meaning. I think some of them were sort of cynical because, of course, they had to do it to get on tender lists. But of course, they had quite often been driven by, as I've mentioned before, practitioner-oriented press. So they were doing something. They didn't really understand it. And that's what led to sort of the gap. And perhaps just to sort of conclude, once I started exploring the literature, what I found was actually sort of a paucity of background information on what this thing actually consisted of. And you know, that's always my stance. If research is about anything, it's about better understanding the nature of the phenomena. And if we do that, we contribute to knowledge and we make our world hopefully a better place. Although, as Oppenheim might sort of, or those who criticize Oppenheim in his development of you know, the atomic bomb, they were saying maybe we make the world a more dangerous place. But nonetheless, you know, that's the nature of sort of human progress, and we're all engaged in that endeavor.
Okay. Did you want to add anything to that, Boston?
I mean, I wouldn't go so far back because I mean, my PhD started, I don't know, 88 or something like that, or 89. I mean, that's many years ago. But I was extremely lucky because I started, if I go just 2 minutes, okay, back, there was just one paper, okay, one paper. And that is kind of now linking probably the knowledge, the research, the literature, kind of. There was one paper which was really, how should I say, informing everything in the first phase when we were preparing the proposal. That was it. That was the only thing which was kind of something close to that what I wanted to do. And that was perfectly fine. I mean, you know, it was even a little bit less papers out there. It was actually less searching machine, less or whatever. And that reading a lot and going to the library and copying and things like that were definitely different. Maybe there was something else out there, okay? We have never found in those 5 years when I was kind of working and finalizing finally actually at one point my PhD. But yeah, that was one paper. So it is a linkage to the literature, definitely, and to the knowledge. When you start then working, and I was measuring a lot and doing things, and then when actually, in my case, it exploded when I was trying to explain the things. So research gap for me was quite a simple thing. There was nothing out there what we wanted to do. But then when you knew it more, and when we were trying to explain why that phenomenon is there, then actually things were getting worse and worse because so many different, even not just knowledge, but even different disciplines of science were actually adding value to the explanation. But once again, if we start, what is the research gap? I mean, we will find today, I guess, because everybody of us has a little bit a different view on that. I hope that at the end we will learn something from each other and from you, actually, who are right now in that phase where you are thinking, what is a research gap? Once again, I will be a little bit provocative, but I think it is strongly linked to the literature. And that should be actually kind of the next triggering point, I would say, of the discussion. And I am happy to come back. But for me, it is important that my students and myself, we don't see actually a lot of literature that has been out there. So knowledge is something else. Might be knowledge there, okay, in many organizations, but I cannot find it. I don't know where to go. So that's why I would say I will stick right now at this point, at the beginning of the discussion, with literature. I would like to have that my students prove me that there is nothing out there in the literature.
Okay.
Let
Did you
me-
want to add anything to
before-
that, Andres?
Yeah, before we move on, and perhaps from a perspective of the research student, on the one side, let's look at the trivial of research gap, literature gap, and knowledge gap, or perhaps literature and research knowledge. Obviously, once students start with their research, they have a knowledge gap. There will be a lot known about the subject, but not to the students. So this is the first gap. Then you have the literature that should cover the issue.
Hey, I don't know. I do not. I mean,
Bastian said in his area, and I will come back to that in a second. In his area, there was just one paper. And once a student tells me that, but I come to that in a second. So there's a gap in the literature. Then the question is, why is there a gap in the literature? Has no one bothered? Or has someone bothered, but then it wasn't written up? So was there no research carried out? That would be the third question. And a lot of times there might be research carried out, but perhaps not the type of research that is ending up in the literature. And this is a phenomenon that you see in particular, if you look, for example, in software engineering. By the time I took my PhD, you wouldn't get the latest research outcomes over published literature. Why? Because it takes way too long to get it published. Therefore, most of the scientists with whom I worked by that time were submitting their research to an MIT-based repository. And everyone who was conducting research in that area knew, if you want to have the state of the art, go to that repository. Don't wait for something to come out.
Is that literature? Is that literature?
We talk about gap. Yeah, so which type of gap are we talking about? Knowledge gap, literature gap, or research gap? Yeah, so there can be something that is a gap, but it's perhaps not in the literature publications that you would consider. And now we come with this. To the claim Bastian had that there was only one paper out. Now, usually if a student tells me there's only one paper out or no one did it, that just means the boundaries are wrong. I would argue it's extremely difficult, in particular in today's times, that something is totally unexplored. What is much more likely is that the boundaries that we drew, or the parameters that we use, or the way we talk with search engines is not producing results, because we are either having to close boundaries or too wide. And both will lead to the fact that we don't find what we need. So from a student perspective, I think it's important to be aware, critically aware, between the trivial knowledge, literature, and research gap, and what that does imply. Elsewise, about the importance of having the boundaries right. And usually your supervisor is helping me to sharpen them. And with this, I give the word back to anyone who wants it.
I might move you on to the next question before we start a challenge. How would you find a research gap? So are there specific steps you would actually need to follow, or is it a bit of can't see the wood for the trees type approach?
Well, I assume that that should be answered by Bastian, who will tell you now, go and take a look at the literature.
No, I will first reply actually to your those three things. And you mentioned actually knowledge by a student. I mean, that's something else I would say. I wouldn't consider that as, I mean, in a way, when we are discussing about the knowledge of the student, because I mean, even our knowledge will never be there where we would like to. So I would not consider that as an important, you know, but I'm serious now. I'm not provoking now, okay? I'm really serious now. I would not consider that actually as an important thing when you are searching for a research gap, because knowledge will be gained, knowledge will be gathered, knowledge will be, I mean, during the course of the PhD and reading so many papers, going to the conferences, trying to figure out, preparing your own paper. I mean, that will be actually kind of gained in those, hopefully 4, maybe 6 years, but definitely it will be gained. But never actually really, I mean, you know, kind of, I don't want to use the word absolute, but it will never be absolute, finally. So that's why I would not consider, even at my point when I started, if I go back, or all of my students, that was for me important. I would never say, because your knowledge is still during the first 1 year or 2 years kind of limited. That does not mean that that is actually kind of influencing your research gap for your study. So that's why I would kind of not count that. I mean, at least for me. But knowledge out there, that's something else. And I'm fine with that, what you said, that actually the latest knowledge was actually at your MIT whatever platform, perfectly fine. But that means that the supervisor will say, go there, search there, because there's the actually latest knowledge. You know, so that's how I see it. So once again, I would go back and yeah, you can actually now start the other part of the discussion. For me, it is important, and literature, once again, literature, it can be taken from many sources. But another thing which is important, once again, is that literature of a proper high quality. You know, sometimes you just have actually guys who are, I don't know, searching for, we discussed that actually, I guess some weeks ago, searching actually for literature and knowledge, because whenever you are reading something, you are building up knowledge. So it depends where you are sourcing your knowledge as well. It's important. So that's why I would come back once again, especially for the, are we talking now DBA or PhD is a little bit a difference, but still not so such a big one. For me, the difference between a DBA and PhD is where you probably start thinking, where you should start developing or searching for your research gap. Because finally, even with a DBA, once again, that is my view, you should justify that through the literature. Because if something is not running in an organization, if something is broken, as Andreas always says, in an organization, that does not mean that somewhere out there, there's knowledge or there has been published something. So it doesn't matter where you start. From my perspective, I will have push my students to search for actually high quality sources in order to understand what has been done and what hasn't been done.
I might throw it to Stephen also, is how do you find a research gap, and are there specific steps you need to follow?
I mean, it's really difficult because quite clearly, as I accept in the sort of the contemporary world, the starting point of any research is what's already been published, and whether there's been one paper, one book, or 1,000 papers and books. I'm actually not greatly worried, because I think you can always find different perspectives. And again, coming back to my own particular experience, because I had one of those incredible sort of conversions, as it were, because I set out to sort of carry out a classical sort of experimental approach, that something was being introduced in practice. So it was very much an empirical view. People were doing something, they expected certain things to happen. Could I measure the effect? And it seemed very simple. It was only when I started sort of exploring it, and actually by I read a fair bit. I would stress that to try and get some sort of handle on this. But what seemed to be sort of pretty absent, and it was kind of, this is the sort of the penny dropping moment, if I may call it that, that they told you what might happen, and tell you how, and they kind of gave broad indications of what you should do, but there was no sort of sense of sort of what actually happened. So what I was looking for, and what was most interested in, what was the empirical experience of people who'd done it. And by that, I sort of then began to recognize that people were doing lots of things with lots of different motivations and aspirations. And what I wanted to capture and did, and this was the nature of the sort of PhD, was to sort of just describe their different approaches and how different people did different things in organizations. So I fully accept that this was a particular approach which suited the sort of the nature of the phenomenon. But had I been doing experimental research in the laboratory, then of course it would have been a very different approach or different methodological approach. And of course, I'm not trying to get into philosophy. I just think the sort of that what research gaps are about is the sort of the adding to understanding. And again, let's face it, you know, why do we carry out research? Well, to develop better understanding. But of course, I'm not sure we've used the sort of the T word yet, and that word is theory. And of course, people kind of get carried away. You've got to sort of add something to theory. Well, you know, I think that that's kind of overstretching a bit. But what theory is better understanding of the subject. And of course, when we talk about doctoral work, or indeed any sort of research for that matter, the classic test is, did we add something that wasn't already there? And that's always the thing that sort of any researcher must have in mind, by perhaps taking different perspectives on things which have maybe been around for quite a long time. That's different perspective. And again, perhaps what I should also add there is that I think that what research requires is a bit of imagination, because quite often in the sort of the search for the sort of the gap, you know, maybe you've got to rethink it and think, well, if I did this differently, what would occur? And that you know, that can provide a pretty good way of doing things. But of course, as we know, the greatest scientific discoveries have been by accident. So there's a degree of that also. So, you know, what I would always sort of say in conclusion is, you know, have plenty of inspiration, have plenty of willingness to sort of to engage in perspiration, because of course it's that which will keep you going. But of course, identifying the sort of the nature of one thing and the nature of something else, and then making that connection, as it were, is, you know, in simple terms, what it's all about. And perhaps finally, what I would add is that just because you think you're doing one thing, don't ever sort of rule out the possibility that in the sort of the journey that you're embarking upon, you may sort of discover something different along the way. And I think that's also very valuable, certainly in terms of the sort of students I've supervised, that when you go out, again, I do appreciate if you're doing something in the laboratory, it's normally fairly fixed to start off with. But certainly when you go out into organizations, lots of things manifest themselves, and you know that the gaps can suddenly sort of open up, you know, before you, something you didn't even contemplate. But hey, as I think I'm getting too much into sort of the philosophy and away from sort of what a research gap is about. I'll hand over to Andreas.
Okay, Andreas, did you want to add to that?
That's not into that area, but rather pick on the area from a doctoral student. So how do you approach the gap? What is the motivation? Do you come from the outcome expectations of your research? I want to develop that cancer cure. I see big data and there are opportunities. I see Internet of Things, and that means big business. So all of that is looking at outcome. And if you start over the outcome expectation, it will be extremely more difficult to identify any gap. If you start on the comparatively to, if you start over the what is broken end, exactly what can you observe, what is not working. I mean, if you want to have a cancer cure, why don't you just go ahead and develop it? Yeah, because I can't. Why can't you? Yeah, because I don't know how A and B would influence that cancer. So why don't you know that? So if you go over that end, you pretty quickly will see, and now we come then back to knowledge, literature, and research, you quickly will see that your knowledge ends. So you dig into the literature, you try to explore why is that happening. And at one point in time, you won't find more literature. And then you can again start and ask yourself, so why is the literature ending here? Is no one carrying out research on that matter? So you start looking for research conducted in that area. And at that point in time, you will finally find potentially a gap where you can enter. So this is why I think it's important to differentiate in between knowledge, literature, and research. And I do absolutely agree with Bastian that the knowledge gap is first and foremost your gaps that won't earn you a doctorate, any doctorate. But it's for you critical to understand this difference in between your knowledge gap or the knowledge gap in general, the literature gap, and then where is the research stopping, which research still has not been undertaken. Was this Jack, back to you?
No, okay, so but moving on to the literature research itself.
Can I just what I would like to actually really stress is what Stephen has said. You know, that
yes,
that creativity, imagination, that's extremely important. But that comes once again, I'll be extremely unpleasant now with reading. Because after you have read some stuff or you have issues in your company, that's something else. That might actually trigger nice, interesting ideas as well. That will actually probably guide you to the research gap. So try to imagine, try to be creative in order to find something what hasn't been done yet. That's extremely important. Don't go with the normal stuff, what the others have done so often. And that, once again, it's so important that you actually get different perspectives from different, even I many times say, even go to other sciences whenever you are on a border. And you are always, in management, actually, you are almost always on a border between different actually sciences. You can always bring some stuff from somewhere else, and that will definitely then hopefully finally not just guide you to the research gap, but at the end, based on research questions, methodology and stuff like that, actually to new knowledge. And that's what we're trying to do. Find things which haven't been done, do something good, do something smart, and finally actually add to new knowledge.
I like the suggestion on looking at other fields. I mean, if you talk, for example, about foresight studies, I mean, if you want to predict or forecast something, you most of the time look backwards. So, or you look in other fields, in comparative fields. So I'm absolutely on that recommendation. With regards to creativity, I have a very different view, but only because creativity is great, but greatness comes at the price of lots of time that you can spend on it.
You lose many hours and many years that way.
You can lose many years, yes. So
yes.
Go ahead if you want greatness, but be prepared to pay the price in time.
Yeah.
I think the one thing I would always caution students against is that sort of the idea that if you read enough, it'll all become apparent. My experience personally and amongst other students is that you can, as everyone will know, when you read paper in a journal, it normally has a lot of references which take you to other research. And again, this is the health one I'd also give, is that much as I like cross-disciplinary research, the challenge then you're trying to do is to sort of, again, in science, it tends to be sort of very bounded. But once you start going into other disciplines, particularly in the world which I operate in, which of course is much more amorphous and sort of, and you know, dare I say at times, highly generalized, you then sort of start, it's spreading out all over the place, and you create this you know, you're trying to climb up one mountain of literature, and then you want to climb up another one. And then make comparisons. It's really, really difficult, and that's why, you know, certainly again, and it's just my particular experience and the experience of some other students, is that if you know what you're interested in, and of course that's the thing, you see, that sort of trying to discover a gap in the literature can often be difficult because you're not quite sure what is and what is not, and that's why I'm always led to sort of the view, if you've got a particular interest in a particular phenomenon, and you know, particularly if it's organizational, I think it's much more difficult, or it's different in the sort of the world of the sort of the hard sciences, I may say. So go and sort of you know, examine it, observe, explore, do what you need to, because I think that will give you confidence to come back and to re-examine the literature with a greater sense of confidence and the ability to sort of recognize the sort of the deficiencies. And again, I make that point very deliberately. I think a lot of the sort of the literature that exists is often quite deficient. But again, that deficiency is you're in, you know, a deficiency means there's a gap. And you know, if you can sort of remedy a particular deficiency, then yeah, you've identified a gap and you've bridged it. And of course, there's your contribution to knowledge.
Yeah, but that you find that actually you have to have some knowledge. You know, that's always that's always that challenge. When am I at the point that I understand that there's a gap in the knowledge or in the methodology or in whatsoever? So that's always that crazy and pleasant thing. Where do I stop? Where do I start? Actually, you know, it's always the question. That's for me actually the biggest challenge.
It's a real difficult one, isn't it? Because of course, expertise. Who says that your expertise has, I mean, again, the views of sort of the lay people, you know, that they have worth, but of course it's, you know, if you go to, I don't know, your coffee house or a public house or whatever it might be, people talk about things and you know, there's lots of interest, but of course they're not talking about in research terms. When we do it as part of the academy, we're looking to do it in a much more structured and systematic way, where the sort of the end result is the contribution to knowledge. And I accept that point entirely, that it's a really difficult one, because quite clearly you're driven by a particular interest or a particular hunch, you know, and again, that can be part of it. And again, I come back to the sort of the fact that the great scientific discoveries, you know, going back millennia, you know, that they were made by people who observed things happening, and they developed theories to sort of to explain all of this. Again, we live in a world which of course is driven by theory, and what we're always looking for, you know, Andreas talked about the sort of the cancer cure, or the sort of the cure for this or that. Again, you know, I wish if I could to be able to develop a time machine and then to go into the future, because I'm sure the world will look very different to the world that we know now. Hopefully one that's post-pandemic, with all the problems that occurs. And again, indeed, let's face it, the pandemic has driven lots of sort of interest in terms of home working and the sort of the impact it's had on our societies, which of course we'll be sort of examining for years to come. So you know, it's the cloud with the silver lining, but nonetheless, it provides opportunities for researchers to better understand, as I say, the world in which we live in.
Well, the amount of articles out there on COVID at this point in time. Just touching on the literature searches. So Stephen, you mentioned about systematic review of like previously published research. How do you actually establish your boundaries in literature search itself?
God, you know, that's just one of those really difficult questions. Yeah, I know, because you know, what I would always say, and I'm talking in very, very sort of broad terms, is that the more narrowly you can define your research interest, and thereby the gap by virtue of that at the outset, the easier you make your job. And dare I say, in my long experience of sort of working with students, is quite often they want to do, as I call it, the world and everything research. They want to read about this and that, and you know, it becomes impossible. So in that sort of sense, and of course there's this thing, well, yeah, do I have to read 10 papers or 100 papers? By and large, it depends, and to some extent it matters, but then it doesn't matter. What you've got to be able to do, of course, when you produce the sort of the piece of research, whether it be for a doctoral thesis or for a research paper, is that you're in command of what the state of you know, the understanding is, the sort of the most seminal papers. And again, you know, Bastian talking about the one paper produced, yeah, you know, that's great, isn't it? Because in a sense, it gives you so much scope. Quite often people are going into an area where there might be, I don't know, hundreds, if not thousands of articles produced. Quite clearly, I don't think any PhD student is ever going to be expected to read thousands of articles. So then what you've got to try and do is a summary of what the sort of the state of knowledge is. So in that sense, and it's a bit of a cop-out answer, all you can do at the time of publication is to demonstrate that you know what the sort of the state of thinking is, and how, therefore, that you've identified where there are, and I come back to that word, deficiencies, or that's, you know, use the word gaps, and that's provided you with the opportunity to sort of to make the connections. But again, I will stress this. I think the sort of the big difficulty a lot of people have is that they're overly ambitious at the outset, and that's what becomes you know, disabling, because of course you as I say, I always think literature can be like mountains. And if you climb more than one mountain, you know, one mountain is enough for anybody. But if you climb many, then of course, you know, it becomes a problem. But nonetheless, I still think there is a sort of a possibility if you're able to sort of to master one discipline with adequate competency, and look at another, and then make the connections between one and the other, then yeah, that might work. But again, it's always a question of sort of talk to your supervisor. And because they are expected to be the sort of the experts in their particular area, that's why you select a particular supervisor. Okay,
Bastian, did you have any comments about establishing boundaries on literature search, or how you go about it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we had a webinar some time ago, which was talking about strategies how to deal with actually literature search. and how to develop that thing to make it a little bit easier for us. So my approach, or my, let's say, discussion with my students goes usually in the direction that they read first overview papers in order to get really a good overview across the literature in that area. If it's one area, hopefully it's one area. If it's two areas, then actually I'm trying to get them that they read actually as I said, in those two areas, those general overview papers, because that is kind of the latest knowledge, the overview across the knowledge as well as literature. So here you're covering two things at once. That's the first thing. And the other thing is, I'll now get some hits from Andreas once again. Then I'll say, try to be a little bit creative and try to find something what you might see is missing. And try to, and then I go, that's my, maybe once again, a little bit a different perspective, how I work with my students. Then we start actually drawing a conceptual framework. And based on that conceptual framework, we are trying actually to develop some new, let's say, perspectives. And then we are trying to follow with those perspectives. And whenever you are reading, you are trying actually to add something to that creativity. But I agree, Andreas, I don't give them actually time for the next 25 years, okay? Because I want to have that PhD ready before as well. Even as I told you, my 6 months is for a DBA, 9 months is actually for a PhD. Read, and we will discuss all the time. And that's another thing which is extremely important. Discussing with your supervisors, okay? Just talk to them, nothing else. That's what I do. Talk to me, let us talk and try to develop something. And the next thing is do the literature review based on keywords. So with your imagination and with your actually kind of, let's say, nice creative framework, you will developing new keywords. And using those keywords, you will finally come, and that's what I always actually request, having 0 hits. And that is how I'm trying 0 hits.
What's a 0 hit?
When you count of when you do your research and searching for a combination of different keywords, at the end the hits should be 0. And then I say, okay, now we are close to there, and now we can actually start thinking about it. So that is how I'm trying to limit the reading and not let them kind of just, you know, get dissolved while they are reading actually in that.
Okay. And I know Andres has quite a different view. Over to you, Andres.
It's perhaps less of a different view, but I'm aware about the false trends, such as interest, creativity, imagination, and what they do with research students. They encourage them to be interested, to be creative, and to imagine, which can or cannot be great, but it's absolutely not, in my view, required. I think I would start with a literature review or with searching over the analytics. So what do you observe? What do you understand? And what do you not understand? So what are you analyzing? So those are concrete things rather than abstract. Creativity is abstract. Imagination, it invites you.
No. When it is linked to your construct, it's not imagining.
I already imagined that Sunday meal. Oh yeah. No, if you start over the analytics, exactly, you look at something, you have evidence and facts, you have figures, and you start Googling that up, then use other search engine of choice. Then you will be pointed to certain areas, and that areas you can follow, and that areas will provide you with further knowledge and information, and you can relate that back and add that to your analytics. Now, the beneficial point of doing that is if you add the analytics immediately, then, and you do that in written, then you write up your research already, because you work over evidence, over observation, and over analytics, which is basically one of the core things that are to be trained in the doctorate. So this is how I would start, and not so much over interest.
Okay, thank you. Can I encourage everybody, if they do have any questions, can certainly put it in the chat or can ask them. What we might do is go on to the next question is, how do you go about justifying the gap once you actually find it? And is there a formula or a format you'd recommend? Don't all jump in at once.
Well, again, I come back to my point that there's a deficiency either in the literature or alternatively that you've gone out into practice, whatever that may mean, but that there's empirically things are being done and misunderstood or misinterpreted, and the job there is to sort of to clarify and provide better theory, in brackets, better explanation, which of course develops into better understanding. And again, we live in a world where we do things because we do it by rote, because of course it's always been that way. Again, until it doesn't happen, you flick the switch and nothing occurs, or nothing happens, and of course you then go to the sort of the user guide and you try and work backwards. And I think that dare say we're nothing if not sort of creatures where we do better want to understand, but most of the time we just assume that things will happen. And I think that's what makes us the sort of the inquisitive creatures we are. Just actually to come back one step, there's always a sort of bit of an issue, and I've seen this with students who sort of they write up a literature chapter at the outset, and they spend 6 months or 9 months working on it, and then they put it to bed or they forget about it, and then they go out and do the research and they write it up. And quite often sort of the doctoral piece of work which have the greatest problem is that there's a kind of mismatch. It doesn't kind of flow, and so you should never sort of see literature as being a sort of kind of once you sort of complete on I don't know, whatever day it may be, that you never return to it. And I think the sort of the best pieces of work are those where, having done the sort of the if that's the which way around you do it, you sort of do the sort of the literature search or the sort of the exploration of sort of concepts and whatever, and developing conceptual frameworks and so on and so forth, then go and do the sort of the research. I think that when you do that, you probably become much better able to interrogate the worth of the literature. So my advice always would be is that make sure you go back and review what you did earlier on. I think I was going to say 9 times out of 10, probably 99, well, maybe, I don't, you choose your own number, but I would be very amazed if any student didn't go back and sort of think about it very differently, having carried out the research. And of course, maybe as a consequence of that, the sort of gaps that they thought existed may not have sort of disappeared. Quite the contrary, there may be different gaps that sort of open up. And again, this is why I always sort of say to students, allow yourself to be open to sort of the world of opportunities and the discoveries of things that you didn't even contemplate.
Are you talking about reading?
I'm talking about knowledge accumulation, however you do that.
Okay.
Because of course, I will be heretical. I think a lot of what's produced is rubbish, and therefore, but the ability to know what is good and what is not so good is really difficult if you're setting out as a sort of I was going to say junior researcher, but you know what I mean. Somebody's embarking upon this journey. How are you supposed to know? And that ability to sort of to differentiate and make those decisions is, and again, as we know with literature, research journals, they have rankings, and the assumption is that if it's in a 5-star journal, it must be brilliant, and then it may be. But so some of the things I've read have been in lower ranked journals, and they've been just as good, but they're saying it in a different way, perhaps. It depends, and of course, as I say, there's a whole world of opinion and different perspectives, and part of working your way through this. I don't know, it's like a 3-dimensional maze at times. You're never quite sure what is and what is not. And the maturity of the researcher, or maturity and confidence comes from sort of understanding what exists, what's out there, or in the sort of the research, what you garner from some research data, and making sense, comparing and contrasting. And it's a really difficult process, dare I say it. And I think it's vastly misunderstood by those who've never done it.
So maybe just you triggered an idea, or I mean, not idea, but no, that's something else. You know, what helps many times, at least, to understand things like better, or maybe to kind of, how should I say, develop the thinking, what is missing or what is not really good, or what could be done in a better way, or how could be improved, and things like that are actually the two sections in the journal papers which are talking about limitations and future research. That is one of the I would say, yeah, how should I say,
Look,
maybe ideas where you can actually collect something as well. First of all, to understand how the, let's say, that paper or that study or whatever it is has been done, what could be done even better. And that can help you actually sometimes to develop some ideas, or maybe even to get a little bit deeper, let's say, knowledge, in order to be more critical while you are reading the papers. So that is another opportunity. I would say I wouldn't go just with that. I mean, you see sometimes that students are coming and saying, oh, I read that gap and that gap and that gap. I mean, that's kind of, you know, close to my topic or close to something, and I go with that. It's not just that, but it is a good, sometimes a good, additional, let's say, triggering point to understand something, what's missing or what hasn't been done in the best possible way, or things like that. So that could be taken into consideration as well.
I'm really conscious of time. It'd be really great to hear from the students and know what their experiences are. But just actually to give you one quick story. About 20 years ago, I did a handful of doctoral research college or research council training colleges. And what I was always amazed at, that you get 200 students turning up, and I would safely said 195 of them were what I call lab-based researchers. So, and what they did is, it was always interesting. They were often quite clever pieces of work they're doing, and very sort of instrumental in, you know, developing science. But essentially, what those students, what had happened is that they had been applied for a scholarship. The research gap, the problem, all the issues, the literature had been sorted out prior to them starting this by their supervisor, and all that they did is they just carried out the experiment. And what struck me is that you had all these very bright people not doing an awful lot of thinking, it seemed to me. I'm being crude, I'm being highly generalized, but because of course all the sort of the difficult things had actually, and the things which I find fascinating but nonetheless challenging, you know, those hurdles had been removed. It was actually a very effective way of getting a PhD quickly, but one where you really didn't have to sort of to agonize too much about what you were doing and how you were doing it.
Okay, Andres, did you have anything else you want to add to about how you go about justifying the gap once you find it? Yeah,
but very short, seeing the time. I think the point in time perspective you might also want to consider. Finding the research gap talks about now. I found it now, and then I carry out my research, I write it up, and there comes the conclusion chapter. And so in hindsight, how do you see the research gap? How would you formulate it then? And if you understood that the gaps perhaps are quite differently than what you thought back then when you did the literature review, so what do you do then? It's a bit, is it a question or is it the answer? What has gone wrong here? If that was a research gap, and in hindsight it looks different, so how does that fit together? So this is what will need some thinking and tuning and engineering at that point in time. So understand that how the gap looks is also a time question. Back to you, Greg.
Okay, there's nothing in the chat as yet. I'll throw a final question at you and then certainly throw it open to everybody. Once you've had the research gap, what's next?
Oh, that's easy.
I was going to say, I just do it. Get out. Look,
Just did it.
That's easy. That's
seriously,
easy.
Boston will probably disagree with this. I always say, yeah, do as much reading as you like to make yourself competent, so at least you know the sort of questions you think you want to ask. you know, if you know what the phenomenon is and how you want to carry out the research, start, because of course I see the two as being coincidental. Research, well, so the knowledge accumulation, both of the sort of the existing literature and the data, they can happen coincidentally, and one informs the other. But you know, I'm a great interpreter of this. You know, having sort of trained as an engineer, that's what my first degree was in. I think that sort of as you develop confidence, you learn to ask better questions, and by asking better questions, you learn to sort of to probe more deeply, and that's what makes us a really competent researcher. And of course, it adds to your sort of your ability to be creative and to use your imagination and all the other things we've talked about. Oh, over to you, Boston.
No. I just lost what I wanted to say. As I said before, it's easy. I mean, for me, what I wanted to say first, now I got it back. That's why, once again, I will stress the importance of the supervisors. Once again, okay? Extremely important. Talk to the supervisors as much as you can. And that means you can, because they should support you. They have to support you, okay? Just go there and talk to them. And they will actually at one point tell you, now the knowledge is there. Now the barriers are there. Now we are there. Don't go farther. That's what you kind of, ask me, that I do not agree with you, that somebody has to read and read and read. And no, I don't agree with that. That's reading. It has limitations, but the students has to have some knowledge before she or he starts actually doing stuff. That's for me important. Don't start doing it. I don't let them do it before they have some knowledge. Okay, that's the idea what I wanted to say.
I'm only going to say it was
the reading.
A piece of advice I had. Well, in fact, there's two pieces of advice. One person said there is no such thing as complete knowledge, and I think if you start to believe that, then it becomes a never-ending task, and you'll never complete. And actually, it was my supervisor who said, think about your sort of your research as being two piles. One is the sort of the literature part, and one is the data part, and it kind of follows on from what I've just sort of said. People, the literature pile gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the data pile never sort of increases. So by keeping them in equivalence, because of course, when it comes to sort of to any piece of research, that there is a kind of rough rule that it's 3/3, and that 1/3 is your literature, 1/3 is your data and discussion, and then the other third is the sort of the introduction, methodology, and conclusions. And if you keep that in mind, then you probably won't go far wrong. And I do appreciate that there are really broad rules, as it were, and that there can be variations. But it served me well, I should say.
Something else, we have students who are totally different, let's say, personalities. And that is actually on the side of the supervisor as well, that she or he takes that into consideration. Because I have had a student who was just trying to read and read and read and even more reading, because he didn't understand that and that and that. And I was getting crazy, I was really getting crazy and going crazy, both actually, because I was said, just stop it, please. I mean, can we at one point start talking how to limit everything? Can we start drawing, I don't know, a concept? Can we? No, I don't understand. I said, I will not use now different words, but at one point you were just getting, wow, stop it. I cannot anymore. Just let us focus it down. And that's important as well. So on the other side, you have some of them who would like to jump and do actually tomorrow the data collection in order to get ready and finished. And I mean, you have everything. So that's another thing what we have to, I guess, kind of accommodate as well. But just now coming back, what you said, what's the next? I mean, next is easy. Research gap. Based on research gap, a good research question, framework, and you are there. That's done. I usually say, at that moment, myself as a supervisor, I'm done with a PhD. That's how I see it. The rest is just working, okay? Nothing else. From my side. Just enjoying actually, and kind of a little bit commenting and discussing and then reading and stuff like that. But that's it. After the research gap has been found, we have the research question, and the research question kind of informs or guides anyway everything. So that's done. That's easy.
Okay.
That's how I see it.
Did you want to add to that at all, Andres? Because I have a couple of questions I want to pose to you all.
Yeah, well, I'm wearing here as a student's hat now, because what's next? Stephen immediately said, just do it. Bastian said, yeah, do it. It's easy. Yeah, I would say it's easy. But as a student, I wouldn't know why it's easy. Because if you are at that point where you have the research gap, you also will know about the existing studies that have been carried out, and they will all come with the methodologies, they will all come with questions, they have been executed, it's known how that worked out. So you don't need to be creative or imaginative, you just pick from those existing studies and try to advance on where there still are open questions. So it's actually really do it. It's very unexciting and boring and requires close to zero creativity, I would argue. That's it.
There is a question, by the way, Jack.
Yes, so I've got several actually.
Oh, right.
Yep, they've been putting in private as well.
Oh, I see, right. Okay.
One of them is, how do you know that there is a research gap?
Right. Right.
Give you a curly one.
Well, gosh, I mean, I'm not sure how to answer that one, because it's everything we've said in the last hour. You've got to demonstrate that there is, I can't think of a better word, some deficiency, some lack, something that can bridge one thing or another and help us to better understand. And if as a result, I mean, let's face it, the whole thing about scientific endeavor, if we learn to, for instance, just I'm not saying go and buy it, but by all means, I've just done a couple of books on the green economy and green manufacturing, but that's our big challenge, to sort of, if we can make our planet a better place by being able to do the things we do without polluting it and making it a dreadful place for future generations, then yeah, that is a really good endeavor, and there's our gap, or if you like, that learning to sort of to fly planes and drive cars and produce whatever it might be, fuel, without sort of creating sort of pollution, and particularly of course the sort of the greenhouse gases, that there's a lot of money going to go into that. So yeah, I think it's just the ability. I think you'll know you've identified a gap when you've done it, and I know that again that seems like a sort of a cop-out, and you've added something to the sort of the sum of knowledge that wasn't there beforehand.
Okay. Did Bastian or Andreas want to add to that before I go to the next one?
No.
No. Okay, the next question was, how would you differentiate between research and a literature gap?
I'll start off here. Sorry to hog it, but because I was looking at this one. I mean, the literature is kind of it's kind of the sum total of knowledge that pertains to sort of the issues and phenomena that you're interested in. Concepts are kind of subsets of that, because of course in literature quite often that you're presented with models, and this is but I say that they always come with health warnings. Because these are sort of a collection of things, the concepts that are put together, which neatly sort of summarize what it is that writer, researcher has put as, or has propounded as being the sort of the basis of whatever it is that's of interest. And again, I'm talking in very general terms. So the literature is, as I say, whatever it might be, books, research papers, whatever else that you use as your sort of your original starting point, the sort of the sum total of knowledge. Concepts are sort of when you sort of break it down. But hey, others may have
Actually,
a different view.
probably a bit of an extension of that too is, what's the difference between a literature gap and a conceptual gap? Are they the one and the same thing?
So sorry, I was actually looking at that question.
So I've got two different questions. So some were private and some are open.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought that's the one that you referred to. So what was the first question?
This one says, what's the difference between a research and a literature gap? And the second one is, what is the difference between a literature gap and a conceptual gap?
Well, I've just answered the second question. The first one, I mean, the gap is the deficiency, the bridge, whatever it is that you're trying to, again, let's analogize as being creating a bridge from one place to another. You're here, you want to get there, somehow or other, you've got to sort of create a bridge over the gap.
What's missing in there? What's the
what's
breach?
missing? Yeah, what's the deficiency missing?
So
I'm interested in this question, if I may say so. For DBA students, we have no supervisor at the beginning.
that's not a
right.
question.
It's not a question, it's a statement.
That's
Yeah, it's a statement.
But
Okay.
I
So
have,
for DBA
I-
students,
I
we have
have-
no supervisor at the beginning. So thank you to DoctorateHub for your support on identifying the research gap.
Okay.
so
Right.
Chibi, I
Statement.
guess there was another webinar at one point, or will be, I forgot. Andreas was preparing that, I guess. So for me, one of the criteria to start a PhD, having a supervisor from the first day on after I have been enrolled. Okay, that's for me the
Excellent.
criteria, one of the most important ones, in case I would be picking an university. I would never go actually that somebody kicks me into 5 modules or 10 modules for 2 years, and I never see actually my supervisor. I cannot do that. I would never do it. That's my view.
Some universities do that.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, and exactly. That's why I wouldn't pick it.
Well,
Never.
it-
I wouldn't
Universities-
pick university
I
like
think-
that. Just saying that's a direct and my advice. I wouldn't do it.
Okay.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry for
point
that.
taken.
Andreas is funny to get a word in, but I to follow on from Bastian, I think that's really shortchanging your students, because you're effectively telling you go out and do all the work, whereas the sort of the supervisor, it's normally expected to be the subject expert. They are in command of what the
And-
state of the art of literature is, and they help you to work your way through it. And if you haven't got that, it's a bit like, you know, coming back to my sort of, you know, climbing a mountain. Normally you use guides and Sherpas and whatever else to help you to get up there. And if you try and do it on your own, don't be surprised if you get into difficulty.
Okay, we've got another question. What do you
Jack,
know?
Jack, let
when
me
do you-
quickly. Jack, let me
Okay, Andres,
quickly,
very quickly.
Yeah, because I don't think it need to be a supervisor. I like the word guide. It must be an expert that is assigned to you, that works with you, because surely enough, the subject matter is not known. So assigning you a supervisor now and later another one is perhaps from a process perspective also not the best thing. But you need expertise, you need guidance. Yeah, you shouldn't be left there alone and figure it out for yourself. That's not how it should be.
I mean, that makes it so much more complicated, and yeah, definitely so much suffering around there. Even with a supervisor, you're suffering, but without the supervisoring or guiding or whatsoever, it's even much worse.
You're flying blind.
I'm sorry, Chibi. Okay, but
Okay.
I had to say it. Okay, I'm really sorry.
Fair enough. We actually have another question is, when do I know the literature gap? Sorry, when I know the literature, try again, I'll go back up one. When do you know that you have got it, that is the gap, and stop reading and refine it and focus on the gap?
Well, as earlier said, knowledge gap, literature gap, research gap, point in time, today, in hindsight, there's no such thing as stopping. Research is fluent, it's always progressing. The gap, as finally understood, will be very different than the gap initially perceived. And the best person to whom to talk at that point in time, likely, as Bastian says, is your supervisor, because they will know the directions that you might want to go and point you into those. So, but yeah, there's no such thing as a fixed gap. That's a fluid understanding.
As I said before, maybe I didn't say it in a proper, I mean, in a more clear way. I define it for my students and with my students when we have found actually the framework. As I said, I'm usually building a framework while they are reading. And when the constructs and the dimensions, let's say now technically put into the keywords, bring me 0 hits. That's how I try to help them.
Okay, so touching on that 0 hits, we've got another question or statement then question. When I know that the literature gap and then want to zero down on the industry, i.e. the area of study, can the field of study be considered a research gap?
I didn't understand that. Can you repeat that?
in the
So
sense
it's when I know the
of-
literature gap and then want to zero down on the industry as in the area of study, can the field of study be considered a research gap?
So you mean there's a lack, there's no research field, or there's a new area, which I
mean, it's a little bit, it's a little bit, I mean, maybe Sonia, maybe you can work a little bit, elaborate a little bit more on that we understand it. Because, I mean, if it's a DBA, as we said, we usually start in the industry. We start in the area, you start with a process or something, let's say what is kind of not really functioning well, or as Andrea says, it's broken. And then we are starting to search whether somebody has some answers to that. Has been done, has been solved in a similar way. If not, then you are probably close to the research gap. That's how I would go and say. Okay,
Sonia, if you want to unmute, you're very welcome to add to that question or comment.
or the knowledge gap, Bastian.
Says the comment was as in there is literature in the medical field, but not in the business field.
Sorry, that doesn't make sense.
Sorry,
the big problem.
Okay, Sonia, you've got the floor. Hang on, Sonia's got the floor.
I'm so sorry, I've made everybody confused on that question. So this is, my topic is on influential relationships. So that I find a lot of study in the medical field. I am a business management student. So I want to bring it down to the business management line. Does that show as a research?
Can I just clarify? Is what you're saying that you want to use medicine to better understand human behavior?
Yes. There are studies on the relationships of how something influences a medical intervention influences how a human behaves, but not in the business field.
But there is, I mean, it's called psychology.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to say psychology. So I want to bring it down to business management. Does that show that that's a research gap?
Well, my first observation is that I think you're complicating it. Forget about medicine. Concentrate on the sort of the nature of what it is that you're interested in, which of course is human behavior. And there's no shortage of business management literature dedicated to human behavior and well, the whole psychological thing. I mean, it's the basis of motivation theory, and that's been going around, been around for about 100 years. How you make that or turn that into a research gap, I do not know, because for as long as there have been managers, for as long as there have been organizations, what managers are trying to do is to sort of to get their workers to work better and harder in a more dedicated way. And there's loads of literature on this, but without knowing more about the sort of the subject, I can't comment. So maybe if you want to add more information.
I mean, I would say it depends if you are. I mean, I don't know. As I said, now it's not medicine or medical area anymore. It's actually psychology, or was it psychology, or was it?
Well, Bastian, psychology is regarded as a science. Psychiatry, that's medicine. Psychology is not medicine.
No. Just exactly. I don't know where is it coming from, but where psychology. Okay, but what I would try to, I mean, what I would advise you is actually that you find the theory which you are trying to use, if there is any, based on these relationships you were talking about, and then try to check whether that has been applied in business or management studies or area or not. If there's something totally new, hasn't been done, then maybe you have found something what would be of interest.
Well,
but
the whole base, sorry, Boston, I was going to say the whole basis of organizational behavior.
I know, it's clear. Once again, I clear, but if there is really something would be of interest, that's what I wanted to say. And that's actually for everybody, because that is what you have tried to say, is that you are bringing something from another field of science. Yeah, sure. Check actually relationships there, check the theory which is supporting those relationships, and then theoretically, you might actually try to apply that for another science. That's how I see it. But once again, I mean, organizational behavior is a big stuff for many decades, and it's still developing, definitely, because unfortunately, many managers still do not understand what should they do, how should they do it, and what's important actually to get the people there.
Okay, well, Sonia's going to look into theories that support relationships. I like the comment made by Helen is I found that I had to go outside the field I'm studying to find what the gap was. And it was enormous, lucky me. Totally agree. Given that there's no more questions in the chat field, is there anything else you want to say to wrap up? I'll go to Steve first.
No, I mean, it's really difficult because, of course, part of the problem is that we're talking in very abstract terms. And again, I recognize that somebody carrying out sort of research in, I don't know, the sciences, which is lab-based, is very different to people sort of carrying out research for a professional doctor in an organization. But nonetheless, the principles still apply. And perhaps just to sort of come back, and maybe you've identified the research gap when you can articulate that in either a hypothesis or alternative, a sort of a research question, because of course that, if you like, is the sort of the engine that's going to drive everything from there on. And part of the difficulty I think that sort of people have at the outset is that they can't articulate it in those sort of terms because of course they don't have the sort of the background knowledge, they haven't done the sufficient reading, or whatever it might be. And by doing greater exploration of what exists, then the hope is, of course, that the sort of something will emerge. But by and large, I think my overall conclusion is you can research anything. Depending upon the way in which you come at it from perhaps a different perspective. So even if something seems to be very mature, and we were just talking about organizational behavior and motivation, which of course is a well-developed concept in sort of in management theory, our ability to better understand what motivates people and how we get better performance, because that's all organizations are interested in, is performance through, I don't know, engagement and whatever else. That's constantly evolving, and always will do, because of course that's the nature of human endeavor.
Anything you want to add to that, Boston?
I would just say I would say three things. Okay, I mean three statements. Let's say first of all, I don't know, Andreas will kill me. Read and dream, but everything during and while and after the discussions with your supervisors. And the second statement, listen once again, the webinar we have just actually produced. I guess we said some quite good things, but maybe it went too fast. So have in mind your issue or your search for gap. Go through once again through the webinar and try to apply that to you. Okay, that's the second one. And the third one, whenever you have issues, just come to our weeklies and we'll discuss them.
Okay, Andres, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, just in closing, beware of false friends and guidance and tips and how it's meant. Now you don't need, I mean, you need to find a research gap, right? You will read that in many guides. You need to find a research gap. The research gap is a result. It's a result of analytics and you not understanding something. You don't understand it. You look into the literature, it's also not understood. So this is the way it works. You don't read the literature with the motivation of finding a gap. Finding the gap is a result. That's it. It's a very standardized process. There's no creativity needed in here. You don't construct a research gap. You construct a research problem. That's a construct. But a research gap is a result. So please approach it from that, very pragmatic. it's something that can be done by the book, and it should be done by the book, because then it will emerge automatically or not. If it's not emerging, then there's no research problem, then all is solved. And you just go ahead and build the cancer cure. And all is fine, all right? So that's it. Jack, back to you.
Okay. I like the comment of one of the participants and said, my husband just called me a wimpy for complaining that I had no supervisor. He said I should just get on with it. There you go, in reference to supervisors. I'd like to thank Stephen, Bastian and Andres for your information tonight. And anybody else, if they've got any questions at all. And what I'll do is I'll turn the recording off if you want to have any open discussion.